Hi, everyone. Good evening from New York. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Non-Credit and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. The CGA is currently celebrating its 15th year preparing global citizens. We do this through our two graduate programs, one in global affairs and a recently launched MS in global security, conflict, and cybercrime. We also offer a variety of professional and personal enrichment courses in the areas of global affairs and fundraising. This includes several professional certificates. We'll send out a follow-up message to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have. We've reserved some time at the end of today's event for questions from the audience. Please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A tool. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Queen's University Center for International and Defense Policy. Now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, CGA's Professor Chris Ankerson. Prior to joining NYU, Dr. Ankerson was the security advisor for the United Nations system in Thailand. Previously, he held positions in the UN assistance to the Khmer Rouge trials in Cambodia, the UN offices in Geneva and Vienna, and with the Department of Safety and Security in New York. From 2000 to 2005, he acted as a strategy consultant to militaries, governments, and private firms in the UK and Canada. From 1988 to 2000, Dr. Ankerson was an officer in the Canadian Forces, serving in Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, including on overseas missions with the UN and NATO. His current research interests include civil military relations, strategic studies, international security, and international relations of Asia. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Professor Ankerson to kick off tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to those joining us from Australia. Thank you for joining us for this timely and important discussion. Again, as Michelle mentioned, we're very happy that it's being jointly hosted by us here at NYU Center for Global Affairs and at Queen's University Center for International and Defense Policy. The recently released Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force Afghanistan Inquiry Report, known as and what will be referred to for the rest of tonight's conversation as the Brereton Report, catalogs a shocking array of serious misdeeds, which, and I have to stress this, have been alleged to have been committed by members of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment between 2005 and 2016, while that unit was operating in Afghanistan. In the words of the Inspector General, the document, quote, discloses allegations of 39 unlawful killings by or involving Australian Defence Force members. The report also discloses separate allegations that Australian Defence Force members cruelly treated persons under their control. None of these alleged crimes was committed during the heat of battle. The alleged victims were non-combatants or no longer combatants, unquote. If proven to be true, these allegations amount to war crimes, and as such, they've already raised a number of questions in Australia and around the world. How should militaries, especially special operations forces, act in war? Is this a matter of a few bad apples, or does it point to a wider problem? Who is responsible, and how should that accountability be enforced? How do issues like race and gender factor into these kinds of incidents? And what should be done moving forward? So tonight's event is going to take the form of a discussion. There'll be no PowerPoint, you'll be happy to know, with me acting as a facilitator, and that will be followed by a Q&A session from those of you joining us in the audience. And allow me to introduce our expert panel who's going to help us make sense of this very complicated subject matter. First, we've got Dr. Pauline Shanks-Karan. She's a professor in the College of Leadership and Ethics and the Admiral James B. Stockdale Chair in Professional Military Ethics at the U.S. Naval War College. She holds a doctorate in philosophy from Temple University and specializes in military ethics, just war theory, philosophy of law, and applied ethics. Most relevant to tonight, she's written a great book, Achilles Goes Asymmetrical, The Warrior, Military Ethics and Contemporary Warfare, published by Routledge in 2014. And her most recent book is called On Disobedience, and it's been published this year by the United States Naval Institute Press. Also happy to be joined by Dr. Jessica Wolfendale. She is professor and department chair in philosophy at Marquette University here in the United States. She holds a doctorate in philosophy from Monash University from Melbourne, Australia. Her work explores the intersection between philosophical theories of political violence, such as just war theory, and the institutions, moral justifications, and social and political narratives that sustain state violence and assist perpetrators of state violence in reconciling their actions. Her most recent book, War Crimes, Causes, Excuses, and Blame, co-authored with Matthew Talbert, was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And finally, we have Dr. Christian Breed, Associate Professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and Deputy Director of our co-hosts, the Centre for International and Defence Policy, both in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. His work focuses on social cohesion, foreign policy analysis, and civil military relations. His most recent publication is an edited volume entitled Culture and the Soldier, Identities, Values, and Norms in Military Engagements, published by the University of British Columbia Press. He has served in the Canadian Armed Forces in Haiti and Afghanistan. So with that great panel on tap, we're very lucky to be able to leap right into the areas raised by this troublesome report. So let me open up our conversation by asking about your thoughts on the notion raised in the report that at the heart of the matter lies, and again, this is another quote, a warrior hero culture of killing. So Pauline, what is a warrior culture and how could it have contributed to the alleged atrocities that we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And just the usual caveat that I'm speaking on my own capacity and not as a representative of my government. So there's a couple of ways to think about it. Historically, a warrior culture tends to be a masculine culture, a group of people set aside within a society that fights the nation's wars, engages in violence. And there's often sort of ritualistic or highly structured ways in which they are selected and trained and the status that they hold within society. Now, as my colleague Shannon French would note, she wrote a book called The Code of the Warrior. Very often warrior cultures do have some kind of moral code that they stick to, although this may vary quite a bit according to the specific warrior culture, whether it's, historically speaking, we're talking about, maybe Sparta or, Blackfeet indigenous tribes from Montana, where I'm from, or the Vikings, or, some people have even described ISIS as kind of a warrior culture. But you have this idea that you have a group of people that's set apart, and it's those people that will engage in violence on behalf of their society or of their group, but they're often accorded special status. And these tend to be, not exclusively, but they tend to be highly masculinized cultures. And so notions of what a warrior is are heavily tied to notions of masculinity and certain kinds of virility. In some cultures, you can't marry until you've been to war. So it affects your status in society. And often the society has a certain relationship with their warriors, often of reverence, sometimes of fear as well. And so it's a particular way of thinking about how we organize people that are going to do killing in warfare. And that might be in tension or in opposition to perhaps something like a citizen soldier or a professional member of a military, or even mercenaries who are sort of paid. This is their job to go do this. And the contrast I would make in my book, I talk about Achilles as sort of the archetypal warrior, because war is not just what he does, it's who he is. It's part of his existential being. And in warrior cultures, violence gives meaning, sometimes even religious meaning, but certainly philosophical and social meanings, right? So there's some deep mythology and meaning making that often goes. So you can think about Achilles as a warrior and maybe Hector as more of the citizen soldier or the soldier. Hector kills and he goes to war, but he'd really rather be doing other things, right? He wants to go back home to his wife and to his city and sort of reclaim his position that he had before. Achilles is really nothing absent war. That is who he is. So that's sort of one lens through which we might look at this. historically. And so the question maybe becomes, what are contemporary warrior cultures like, and how do we think about that in the contemporary context?
Yeah, so let's carry that on a little bit. Jessica, do you want to come in on this idea of warrior culture?
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. I found that really interesting, actually, having that historical background. And I also want to, a side note, thank Krista for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I was thinking too about the relationship within the concept of warrior, and not just the sort of connection between use of violence and toughness as being marks of masculinity. So one thing that was interesting to me in the report is the link between the conception of warrior as it played out in the Australian forces and very Australian masculine ideals, particularly around being a larrikin, breaking the rules, being tough. So there's this kind of continuity between cultural norms about masculinity and then how that is sort of translated and almost intensified in the context of a military identity as warrior. And one thing I thought too, while Pauline was talking, was that the concept of a warrior, this is why, I for one have reservations about the use of this term in the context of the contemporary military in particular, is that warriors require an enemy, right? That the identity is built around protecting your group from the enemy, whoever the enemy happens to be. And so that really, I think, does create a problem, particularly when you have military forces today engaging with civilian populations, engaging in roles which are very different from fighting an enemy. And so I wonder whether that was also an aspect of what was going on in Afghanistan as well, is that, heavily warrior identified, where it's, violence and toughness are marks of masculinity. Combat is viewed as really only the real form of soldiering, and non-combat roles are dismissed as being not, really, not true soldiering. And I noticed too in the report, they talk about some admiration for the US practice in relation to detention, treatment of detainees, and the kind of toughness there was admired, according to the report, was admired by the soldiers. And again, that also, I think, echoes this idea that toughness, humiliating the enemy, is actually part of what it is to be a true warrior and a true soldier. So there's very, at least in that context, very sort of toxic elements of this that I think came out. Now, that doesn't mean the concept of the warrior, therefore, is toxic across the board, but there are elements in it and the way it intersects with other conceptions of masculinity that I think can make it very toxic.
Yeah, I think that comes across very clearly in the report.
Right.
Christian, some people have come to the defense of the Australian ADF, the soldiers, the units, and the Australian military writ large by saying, hey, listen, stuff like this happens. Or, what did we expect? We can't expect to fight a war with one hand tied behind our back. How would you respond to that in the kind of context that we're seeing in this report, which goes to great lengths, as I quoted in the beginning, to make it clear that none of what's being covered in this report is a close call, or he drew on me first, or I came around the corner and was surprised. This is all very much outside of that real combat arena. How would you respond to those kind of, by now, I think, a bit tired and tested responses to say, war happens?
Yeah, I think what, like you said at the outset, and first off, I want to echo what Pauline started by saying. First, by that, my views are those of myself and based on my own research and analysis of all of what we see here, and does not reflect the government of Canada or the Canadian Armed Forces in any way. And again, thank you very much for the introduction and to be part of this great panel. I'm frankly humbled to be in this company. So this is great. But what I'd like to sort of start by saying is that argument of that this is just war doesn't fly, because of course you made it very clear that this wasn't what happened. But let me start by telling a story. And so this idea of the warrior, hits really close to home for me for a variety of reasons. One, it's something that we've sort of foisted aboard in Canada in the Canadian Armed Forces as well, and we're looking at it again now with a critical eye, which is good. But certainly my time in the operational side of things was very much part of the discussion and part of the culture that we were trying to espouse, was this idea of warriorhood and warriorship. And so my story is one of guilt and inadequacy that never goes away. And so I was late to my own deployment to Afghanistan as a soldier. I didn't deploy till I was a mid-level captain. Peers and colleagues and friends, and those even junior to me, deployed before I did, and got their star and their campaign star and their medals and their experiences. And I was in Haiti for a few months. That obviously didn't seem like enough, because that's not where the show was, so to speak, for Canada. So I felt like I was on the sidelines. So in 2008, my time came and I went and I thought, okay, I'm going to feel a sense of relief that, okay, I'm finally going to Afghanistan. Well, that relief was short-lived because then it was like, well, I'm just with the PRT. I'm not with the battle group. And sort of if you think about Canada's experience in Afghanistan, we had these three different components that were deployed, and the battle group was where the fighting was being done. Right? The omelet was where the fighting was being done because we're doing it in partnership with the Afghan National Army. But the PRT, well, we're just doing reconstruction. And so there was that. And then when we get to the PRT, we reconcile that what we're doing is very important and equally dangerous, to be frank. But then as I get to the PRT and I do my job, I'm like, well, I'm not going outside the wire enough, right? Because that's not my job. But at the end of the day, I'm not outside as much as my platoon commanders or some of my soldiers because I'm the second in command of the company. So I'm supposed to stay behind and do the administration. And so I wasn't outside the wire enough. And then I figured, okay, well, I'll reconcile that, and we redeploy back home to Canada. And I'm like, well, there we go. My mission to Afghanistan is complete. I got my star. I should be good, right? Well, I've only been once, right? Others I know have been twice, some three, maybe even four times. So what I'm getting at is this idea of what's known as persistent testing within the literature on warrior culture. And this is from the work of Stephen Gardner back in 2012, where he talks about one of these aspects of the warrior, which is this idea that it is never enough. You're always being tested. And every time you do something, it's almost like the goalposts cruelly move another few yards down the pitch. And now you got to do the next thing to still be part of the warrior club, if you will. And so this is what I think is starting to happen. When you start to embrace the warrior as a cultural identity within an institution, you open yourself up to these sorts of activities and behaviors that can happen, not because maybe people are inherently evil or cruel, but because the institution is pushing them that way. And not intentionally so, but certainly because of this idea that we have to test. We have to show that we're still a warrior. We have to show that we're still part of the club. We're still part of that. The term that jumped out at me in the Brereton Report was this idea of blooding. That we needed to blood our soldiers. This plays right into that idea of persistent testing, which will never be enough. And that was the big takeaway for me personally. It says never going to be enough. So I got to park that, let that go. It's never going to be enough. But I only came to that after some pretty intense reflection through my own research, but also just personal work and growth. And I don't think we're putting that on top of all of this stuff of let's adopt the warrior culture. But by the way, understand all this baggage and let's work through that too. Which, if we did that, that's one thing. But of course, we're not. We're just throwing the word around. Like, I think the way that you articulated this at the beginning of all of this, which is, an attempt at applying an inclusive single word to all the various identities that we have within the armed services. But we forget the baggage that goes along with it. So that's, this persistent testing thing really sticks in my mind when I think of the warrior. It's a real risk that we assume if we start using that language in an institution.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. I think it's fascinating because, again, this idea that everybody can be a soldier, right? You read in the report that the soldier is kind of a generic baseline term, but if you really want to distinguish yourself, then you need to do something more. And as you say, that something more in this case, or the specific cases under review here, are war crimes, right? If they're proven to be true, they're definitely war crimes. And Jessica, you've done a lot of work on war crimes. What struck you in reading the report that kind of links maybe some commonalities between what's being alleged in the Brereton Report and what you've seen elsewhere? Maybe some similarities or differences. I know the work you've done is kind of justifications, for example. So maybe that feeds a little bit into what we've just been talking about.
Well, what was interesting to me is that, what we see in the Brereton Report is very, very similar to what Donna Winslow documented in her report on the Canadian Airborne Regiment in, I think it was 1997, her report, in relation to atrocities committed in Somalia. And it's very similar to what we see also in my previous work I've done on military torture. Often in some of the military dictatorships in Latin America and in Greece, which engaged in systematic torture, there were sort of special units who did that work. So in Greece, there were military police units who, very similar to special forces, they underwent special training, they had special liberties, they were treated as being exceptional, as being different from the rest of the army. And again, you see this idea of testing that Dr. Breed is talking about, hazing and initiation as being a really crucial part of sort of entry into an acceptance by those units. And again, that we see that in the Somalia report. I don't see much reference to hazing initiation rites. Well, actually, there is this idea of blooding in this one. And I think there you see a very explicit connection to the way in which warrior culture is gendered. because there's a quote from the report talking about the new team member who would be, entered into the unit fresh into theatre, who hadn't yet shot someone, would be required to shoot the prisoner. And this is a quote from the report, I think from someone who was interviewed for it, to pop his cherry, right? And that's a, explicitly sexual reference. And so there's an explicit connection between gender and sort of being part of the team. And killing someone is analogized to losing virginity, right? As a right of masculinity. So you see that in all these other cases. What's interesting, I think, about this case too, is that while the focus of the book on war crimes that I wrote with Matthew Talbot is often sort of institutionalized large-scale crimes, you still see these elements in there. I mean, again, the Greek case is illustrative because that was an institutionalized system of torture, but it had the same features that we see in some of the special forces: appeal to exceptionalism, being special, so forth. And so that's something which I think is it's just consistent with pretty much all the sort of war crimes cases that I've looked at. I mean, the difference obviously between this case and something like the US torture program is that these special forces were not acting under orders. They weren't carrying out a policy. But you still see these processes of normalization and justification occurring at that smaller level, right? Combined with this appeal to exceptionalism, rule breaking, masculinity, toughness, hazing, etc. I just wanted to circle back to something that you asked Dr. Breed too about, people keep saying, yeah, but war is hell. So on the one hand, this is sort of shock and horror that it happens. On the other hand, there's this response is that, well, what do we expect, right? And I wonder if behind that is an appeal to this idea that, well, maybe what's going on isn't so much the people, but the situation, that there's features of combat that just turn people into war criminals sometimes. And so, of course, because war has these features, then of course we can't expect good people to be immune from the impact of those features. And I think, I agree with you. I think that's a sort of misunderstanding of actually the way in which war crimes come to be internalized in a sense. The justification becomes internalized, they become normal, they become tied up with the self-conception of the soldier. And one of the things that's utterly consistent across all kinds of war crimes that I've studied at least, is that for the perpetrator, what's crucial is reconciling what they're doing with their conception of themselves as a good or honorable person. And in this case, it might be reconciling what they're doing with their belief that they are the true warrior, right? They are, the exemplar of the warrior. So, this idea that, well, good people couldn't do that fails to address the fact that good people do that. And one of the ways in which they are able to do it is by seeing what they're doing as part of what it is to be a good person or a good soldier or a good warrior, something like that. So that I think is something that's really crucial in understanding the similarities across all these different kinds of war crimes across different countries. Like it's remarkable how similar the processes are.
Yeah, that's I think a piece that, of course, any one report is going to be a little bit blind to, but it's useful, I think, to look at that. We can maybe get into the idea of the lessons learned or the lessons not learned from the Somalia report a little bit later. But I wanted to go to you, Pauline, because again, you've done a lot of research on American war crimes and atrocities in Vietnam, for example, in the My Lai massacre. Are there any things that you noticed as being perhaps similar between that one-off case and maybe what we're seeing here in Australia, where there are commonalities as Professor or as Jessica mentioned?
Yeah, so just building off what Jessica just said, I mean, she was talking about how it's necessary for the individual to sort of reconcile what they were doing with their vision of being a good soldier or a good person. I would just expand that to the group dynamic as well, and then the Somalia case is a good example of that. But so is My Lai. I mean, and of course, Chris Browning's famous book, Ordinary Men, which gets to the sort of group membership thing. And we also know this from research on child soldiers. One of the first things that when child soldiers are abducted, they have them kill their own family members or members of their own village so they can't go home, right? But the other point to that exercise is to build alliance within the combat group, because once you have committed an atrocity, then there's sort of pressure on the other people in the group to do so, because then you're sort of all in it together, right? And we see this with criminal gang warfare studies in the United States. So it's also worth thinking about how things like unit cohesion and esprit de corps and all of these things that we think are important to combat performance, which are important to combat performance, then can be turned and can be used when people are committing atrocities to sort of reinforce, to cover up. So I'm sort of struck the blooding thing is something that, there is some discussion of that in Vietnam, because My Lai was not an unusual kind of event. These kinds of attacks on non-combatants were, happened in Vietnam. It was in a way part of the policy. And so it's extraordinary perhaps in its number, and it's extraordinary because pictures surfaced. And so one might ask the question about, to what degree do things like that, and the same thing with Abu Ghraib, would Abu Ghraib have had the same impact without the picture? So I think that group dynamic is important also. And so I think in the United States cases, and perhaps with the British cases as well, with special forces, there's a very tight, like, unit cohesion sense of group identity that's going on there. And so I think we also have to think about that. It's not just that they saw themselves maybe as being a good warrior, a good soldier, but that it was important for their status within the group to maintain that. And so there's a sort of, is there a one-upping? Is there, bringing, so Jessica mentioned when you bring in the new person, there's sort of these rites of passage, which are often highly sexualized and highly tied to a very specific notion of masculinity. But then that's not a one-off event. Those kinds of things are constantly reinforced to maintain that culture within the unit. And to maintain the fact that you've already done these horrible things, so why not do some more? Because you're already sort of in for a penny, in for a pound. And so there's this kind of moral erosion that can happen. I think the book Black Hearts, although it doesn't deal necessarily with special forces, there's some interesting insights there about culture and leadership and how these kinds of things can happen. And the same thing with My Lai. I mean, I think if you study My Lai, it's not entirely shocking that something like this ended up happening, just as if you read Black Hearts, which is very gut-wrenching even for someone like me who studies this stuff. Like, where this story is going. And I was really struck by reading Black Hearts a few years ago and being really depressed that we learned nothing, it seemed, from My Lai, because it read just like My Lai in lots of ways. And so this report, there aren't complete parallels, but there are certain kinds of parallels. And I'm really struck more by the sort of the culture issue and the unit dynamics issue, and the blooding is sort of one example of that.
I'll come to you in just a second, Jessica, but I think one of the things that struck me that is interesting is that in, My Lai, you have this Thompson character who actually puts his life on the line, puts his reputation on the line, puts the lives of some of the people under his command on the line to actively stop what's going on, right? And then also report it. And the treatment that he was given was obviously kind of reinforced the fact that what he did was quite extraordinary, to speak out and actually try to stop this group dynamic that was happening. You could opt out maybe, but certainly it was beyond the pale to interfere. And yet in the Brereton Report, Major General Brereton spends a lot of time talking about the bravery of those people who came forward and trying to praise those people who were actually, forthcoming, and intimates that a lot of people were not. There was a cone of silence, kind of a stonewall approach by many people in the units that refused to cooperate. So how do we, maybe I put this to Pauline and then to Christian, how do we actually overcome that? How do we put in place more Thompsons and fewer people who are willing to go along, even if they're not going to even if they're not the kind of bad people who do atrocities? How do we actually, reward and valorize that kind of moral courage to the level where people are willing to speak out?
Yeah, that's a really, really tough question. I think some people would say that, Thompson is this example of, extraordinary, moral courage and heroism, and he certainly displayed moral courage. But are there ways to set a culture where people I think people have to practice moral courage in the same way they have to practice physical courage. And so do we give people smaller opportunities along the way? I mean, the Stoics were really into this idea of rehearsal, and that you needed to rehearse certain things. And so do we give people a chance to rehearse moral courage? And moral courage is standing up against your own peer group. And many things in the military actually act in this, I talk about this in the obedience book, sort of actively mitigate against this, right? And so I think we have to reassess, some things like good order and discipline, which is necessary, but can you still have some good order and discipline and allow people opportunities to practice moral courage in a low stakes environment? Or the British have this sort of reasonable challenge idea that I know my colleague, Dr. David Wetham, has talked about. There's a way to practice sort of standing up and challenging in certain sort of circumstances so people can practice this. So that it's more likely that in a situation people will exhibit this kind of moral courage. But I think it's very, very difficult because everything in the military is oriented around things like unit cohesion and loyalty to your own peer group. And so I think we have to also cultivate things like loyalty to the institution, or in the United States, we talk about loyalty to your oath to the Constitution. Right. But that's very, very difficult. And I think you saw that in the case of My Lai. There were people at My Lai, there were men at My Lai that sort of just quietly walked away and didn't participate, but they didn't do what Thompson did. They didn't stop it. They didn't themselves maybe participate in it. And one guy shot himself in the foot, so he couldn't, participate. So I think it's worth thinking about how can we allow people small stakes ways to practice.
Jessica, I know you want to come in, and then I'll give it to Christian.
Story. So I have teenagers. Yeah, so I have teenagers, and I don't want to wait for them to go out into the world before they have to practice making hard decisions about things. So there may be times when I will engage in negotiations around obedience in my own household and let them try to practice, some selective disobedience or some standing up to mom in certain situations, so that then I know that they can do, and we discuss it afterwards, right? And then I know that they can do it when they sort of leave home and go out there. So I guess I'd ask us to think about our education and training context. And are you giving people a chance to practice this in low stakes way? Because if they won't speak up, so we had the Fort Hood report this week, if people won't speak up about sexual assault, then I can speak up about war crimes, right? If they're not going to speak up to go to the Lying to Ourselves report about pencil whipping reports, like if they're not going to stand up there, they're certainly not going to stand up when it comes to war crimes. So I think we have to look at the low stakes events first and having people practice that.
Thanks for that. Jessica, please.
Yeah, I'd like to combine sort of both something which related to your earlier point, but also this idea about how can we cultivate different kinds of moral courage. And one of the things that Pauline said earlier is that it's not just about reconciling the individual conception with what they're doing, but the group, right? And I think that's right. And so what we see too is with these units, and also in some ways with the military profession as a whole, there's a mythology, a narrative around what the group is and what it means. And often that mythology and narrative has very little to do with what the actual history of how that unit, that group, the military has been used. And so in America, it's quite striking in relation to torture. There's a sort of narrative of we don't do torture. And there's this long history of research on torture and use of torture in a range of different contexts. So there's this kind of, I can't think of the right word, it's a sort of cognitive dissonance, right? How do you reconcile this group narrative and identity with the reality of what's happened in the past? So I think one of the ways to cultivate moral courage is to cultivate challenges to these narratives, cultivate alternative narratives, confront, and this would have to take place through the process of education and training, is to say, hey, and I think in Australia this is the case too, so, there's this perception of the Anzac soldier as being a certain way. There's a mythology around it that's very strong. And then And that mythology tends to take precedence against evidence that contradicts it. And so challenging the mythology, I think, has to be a very crucial way too of then allowing dissenting narratives space to breathe and be heard. And that's one way in which you could start with this small stakes way of, disobedience, well, not disobedience, but standing up to orders, challenging orders, disobeying perhaps. So I think that's something that's really important, is actually like critically analysing these mythologies that are a big part of the military identity.
Christian, that brings up an interesting point, right? Because in some senses, it's, not to say that you can understand it, but this idea of we need to challenge ourselves, we need to excel on the battlefield, we need to be the best kind of soldiers we can be. There may be some aggregate benefit to that. However, what we're seeing here in a way is an identity formed around cowardly acts. These are torturing prisoners. These are killing people under control. These are killing people who are youths, if not children, and then lying about it. So there's not a lot of honorable component here going, that you could somehow say, we did foolhardy things like rushed machine gun posts single-handedly, or swam swollen rivers with knives in our mouths. The kind of stuff that you might build a positive mythology around, as Jessica was saying. But in some senses, this is really low rent, low budget stuff that no great legend or lore is going to be about. To say that we handcuff people behind their backs and then slit their throats doesn't really sound like the kind of things about which a warrior culture can be made out of. So how do we square that these elite units who have tales of daring do that they could be talking about, they're the same kinds of units that are winning Victoria Crosses and medals of bravery for their actual acts of heroism, and at the same time there's some subset of that says, hey, let's go out and kill a couple kids this afternoon and drop some fake weapons at their feet.
So again, I go back to some of the attributes of the warrior just at the most fundamental level, which is, we talked about a few of those already, like the testing and sort of this idea that this impact it has on cohesion. And one of the things, of course, about cohesion is that it's exclusive, right? Not everybody gets to be on the team. Not everybody gets to be part of a certain club. And so this identity, again, that you ascribe to the warrior is intensely othering. And by that, I mean, it makes you the center of your universe, and everyone else is not nearly as good as you. And so this goes right back to some of the classical ways in which we do training in the military, which is to dehumanize the enemy, all right? So that we allow our soldiers to do this fundamentally horrendous thing of taking life. And so this just gets amped up when you start adopting this warrior piece, because you're doing this intense othering. So I think it's a bit of a circuitous route, but you can draw the line to say that if you are espousing these ideas of the warrior, which have some absolutely beneficial pieces, like some of the things you identified, these acts of genuine heroism, acts of genuine selflessness for the cause. But again, it's a double-edged sword. And so the other side of this is that you're able to do this because you're othering the enemy, and you're othering those that are around you. You're othering the non-warriors in your own unit, the folk, as an infantry officer, and then Chris, you probably have heard this too, right? If you're not in the infantry, well, everybody's important, but their job is to support us as the infantry, right? That's how the joke goes. And so that same sort of thing happens, but then you just keep rolling it down to the point where, well, if you're not in our military, then you're not worth that much. And if you're a local in an area where we've been subjected to roadside bombings and ambushes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, well, you're clearly not the same as me and deserve the same sort of treatment. And so you start to see this path to othering, to the point where you actually dehumanize them, to the point where somehow you twist it to make it okay that this is what you're doing. And sure, it's not the same heroics, but it's totally understandable, because they're not real people. They're not real. They're less than human almost, right? It becomes really, really quite nasty and quite horrendous. But this is that sort of path you start to walk if you really unquestioningly adopt this warrior ethos, which is what we've problematized with this entire panel. And so that's where I see that challenge coming from. But I want to jump on something that that both Pauline and Jessica were talking about too, which is this idea of cohesion more generally, and in particular this idea of how do we get our soldiers to question the right orders? And all that was coming in my mind as I was listening to this is, this is a really gnarly problem. This is the idea of basically we're kind of wanting our cake and eating it too. follow orders until it's wrong to follow them. And only you will know after the fact whether it's wrong or not. And if you don't get it right, well, then it's on you. And we can go right back to Nuremberg, right? With this was the big takeaway, the big deduction that came into the way in which we think about and conceptualize our ways of warfighting today. Saying you were just following orders no longer cuts it. So how do we build that moral courage to say to a particular order, no, this isn't what we're going to do. This isn't right. How do we get more of those Thompsons, like you said? That's a really tricky proposition in an organization like a military that really values obedience, like you said. And so I don't know what the solution is other than, and this is probably, we've heard it a few times now coming from us. I think we might be betraying our professional backgrounds here a little bit. It's education. And I don't think that it's another online course that we all have to tick some boxes in and disregard. But I think it's focused education in terms of really picking and choosing discussions we want to have. It's one of the things I love about teaching at the Royal Military College as a professor, is that I get to lean on my uniformed experience as well in the classroom and bring forward personal experiences and talk to the students about that in a more personable way, in terms of, well, this is, we're talking about this theory of international relations and foreign policy, but here's how it actually played out and how I saw it play out, for good or ill, in a place like Afghanistan or Haiti. And we start to have those hard questions, those hard discussions with my officer cadets, and hopefully some of that sticks with them as they move forward in their professional military careers, and hopefully inform some of their decisions and build some of that moral courage, because I think it is an intensely personal decision. It's one of those things where you have to, as an officer especially, or any soldier in the field of battle, to sort of think to yourself all the time, can I look at myself in the mirror tomorrow after doing what I'm thinking about doing, regardless of whether it's an order or not? And I think that's a really difficult question to allow a soldier to ask themselves without feeling that they're being disobedient or being, being not brave. And in fact, of course, all the literature on that says it's quite the opposite, but that is the essence of bravery and courage and courage. So it's tricky, and I don't know what the solution is.
I do find it ironic in the same way that somehow acts of cowardice are seen as badges of honor, which I think is an interesting tension, but also the same units that pride themselves on a flat chain of command, the idea that you can challenge your platoon commander or your troop leader if they're not kicking in a door the right way, or they didn't lay out an ambush the right way, the kind of idea that everybody's an expert and should be able to put their hand up and say, stop, I think this is the wrong way of doing it. And whether a corporal's raising his hand or not, then that should be expected, because these are real elite people who address each other by their first name and have no problems with this kind of irreverent, what would be conceived of as irreverent in other units. In these elite units, it's kind of par for the course. They value that. They certainly tell everybody that's what makes them special. And yet they lack that ability to raise a hand and say, hey, this is something that's not going well, when it boils down to, according to the report at least, what's happening in the corporal's mess, what's happening at the patrol level and beneath it. I think it's an interesting, and I certainly don't have any way of resolving it, but it is an interesting tension that it goes back to what Jessica said, the kind of advertised story and myth doesn't necessarily line up with what's actually going on. But Pauline, I want to come to you on something that Christian had said, which is this idea of othering, right? And I've already gone on a little bit about how most of what's been talked about in the report involves prisoners of war or persons under control, right? And I think coupled with the fact that these are almost always brown and black bodies suffering violence at the hands of Western white soldiers, you can't really help but be struck by the parallels between this report and what we saw happen kind of very much in front of our eyes this summer with the death of George Floyd. So we've spoken a little bit about the gendered aspects of this, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how the racialized aspects of these atrocities and other battlefield atrocities are worked in.
Sure, I'll say a little bit, but the piece Jessica wrote this week actually addressed that. So when I'm done, I'll toss it to Jessica, because I think she can really do a better job. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is habits of mind. So if there was I think I was looking at the Q&A, there's a question about sort of colonial wars, right? If there are habits within a society of marginalizing, using violence against brown and black people, as there is, say, in the United States, I think those are habits that don't then just disappear when people join the military, right? You're habituated in certain ways, at least where it's normalized, where it's like, oh, well, this is something that happens, but it's more shocking when it happens to a white person. So I find it hard to believe, and I think my study of My Lai certainly bore that out, right? That people's experience of, what was going on in the American South post, Reconstruction, right, is still within the historical memory. I mean, it's still part of the experience, even of people who didn't live in the South. So if that's part of the national consciousness, then somehow it's going to be less shocking, or you're going to view those people in a different kind of way. And I think, to get to the cowardice thing, it's only cowardice if you view those people as equals, right? And the whole, a lot of the military honor, is rooted in notions of medieval chivalry, which were rooted in notions of class and inequality. And it was wrong for knights to kill people who weren't knights, really because it was sort of denigrating yourself. You were lowering yourself to a lower class. You should only kill people who were sort of your equals. So there's an interesting tension there. Right. So these things are only cowardice if you sort of view the victims as equal humans. But if they're not equal humans, then this is about dominance. And to the degree that dominance and control are themes that play out every day in our justice system, or our alleged justice system, our criminal, and legal system, would it be a surprise that at least some of that subconsciously, at least, filters into people's experiences, because you've been raised in a society where you have these, these constant messages and these constant tapes, both around gender and around, race and ethnicity. So I think that's not to excuse it, but it is to say that we, clearly that's a piece of it. We've all heard the stories of, especially African American soldiers who go to fight in World War II, and they have to come back and fight in World War II for rights that their families don't possess back home. So I think it's worth looking at the connections between those. But I think Jessica probably has a deeper insight. I thought her article was really great. So.
Yeah, I agree. So I'd like to turn it over to Jessica now to answer that same question. How do you think ideas of race and racialization factor into this?
I think they factor in a very complex set of ways. So Pauline's right, of course, is that people in the military come from their society and they bring with them the attitudes from their society. But I think too, when we're thinking about Australia and US too, what we see is, we don't see a sort of hard and fast difference between the way in which sort of indifference to the lives of Black and brown people manifests in the context of war against people from Afghanistan. And the same kind of indifference manifests in the attitudes towards violence against Black and brown people in America. And so you see that indifference both in obviously the perpetrators themselves, but and again, we don't yet know why the complaints were not investigated, but there were complaints made about the behaviour of Australian forces, but they weren't investigated, but we don't know why because it's redacted. So, but it's suggestive of an indifference. It's suggestive of a kind of what, Fricker calls epistemic injustice, that the testimony of these people is disregarded. And that's something that's very characteristic of a racist system, is that the people who are viewed as being sort of less than equal, their testimony, it lacks credibility in the eyes of the people who possess power. So their suffering doesn't matter as much, their testimony about their suffering doesn't matter as much, and it's the perpetrators' perspectives who are given priority. And you see that particularly, I think, with the case of George Floyd and other police killings of unarmed Black men and women, which is that so often the perpetrators are either not prosecuted, or if they are, they're not found guilty, and there's sympathy for them. So the sympathy is for the perpetrator, not the victim. And I think that also does pan out here a bit. We're not hearing much about who the victims are. And this is true I was thinking about the massacre in Haditha, actually, and one of the reports about that also found a sort of widespread contempt in the language that was used to talk about civilian casualties broadly at that time, not just by the Marines who committed that massacre. So Yeah, so I think, like I said, I think it's very complex, and I think it does link, as one of the questions in the Q&A said, to colonial heritage too. So in Britain, for example, where again, there's this narrative of the British military, and then there's this history of the British military in, for example, Kenya, using torture and internment camps against Kenyan civilians. And so the sort of colonial history is a really important part of the embedded ways in which racism can manifest. And I think in Australia too, this is something which I would like to investigate more. You know, the history of the treatment of Indigenous people, and this is true in America and Canada as well. I mean, what is the military involvement in that? And how does that sort of create a generalized contempt or indifference? It's not, I'm not talking necessarily that people have conscious attitudes of hatred, but it may just be that as a blindness or an erasure of the experiences of Black and brown people occurs. And that it lends itself then to the treatment of Black and brown people in ways that would never be accepted if those people were white. So that's kind of my thoughts. And I think in the Australian case too, we can't ignore the connection with the widespread Islamophobia that's in Australian society. It's not accidental that the people who are murdered are Afghan people. And I think that's similar. You see that in Australia, you see that in the US as well, in relation to the attitude towards civilians who are being killed by the ongoing use of drone attacks, airstrikes. So there's been a dramatic increase in civilian deaths from airstrikes since the Trump administration, although the airstrikes began under Bush. And there's basically there's no outcry about it. There's not really hardly any coverage about it. It's not talked about in the debates. So there's this sort of ongoing blindness and erasure of this suffering that's very much based around race, I think. So that's I'm trying to cover a lot of bases there, but I think there's a lot of bases to cover and complexities of the way in which this plays out. Just one very last quick point. I think we also see it in the militarization of immigration in America. So narratives of national security threats, narratives of immigrants as potential terrorists have been used to justify, what I would call torturous treatment of asylum seekers. So again, you see these sort of narratives of portraying whole people as threats, as bad. And that then is taken to justify indifference to their suffering, treating them in these ways. So I'll leave it there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating conversation that could go on forever, but I want to kind of switch to the final piece that we're talking about, which looks like a lot of the questions are centered on too, which is what is to be done, right? How can we address issues like this so that the bookshelf doesn't include the Somalia inquiry, the Brereton report ad infinitum into the future? And again, prosecution of individuals will take it that as written, where it's appropriate. That will happen in the accordance of administrative discipline and criminal proceedings. Fine. But what other things need to go there? And I'll go to you first, Christian. What was very interesting in the report was this almost, I read it as kind of an excusal to say, well, the officers can't really be blamed, and certainly higher up, because they were kept out of it. They weren't aware there was this intentional distance being put between the patrols and the leadership. Where do you see a leadership responsibility beginning, and how do we actually fix that going forward so that it doesn't have these gaps between it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a complete leadership failure. I was shocked when I read that. I was very surprised. I had to check the calendar. Am I reading this 20 years ago? Like, we've been down this path before. We've realized that no, the officers are absolutely accountable. The buck literally stops with them. That's why they have that commission. That's the whole point of the commission. Again, it's a privilege. It's an honor to command soldiers, but it's also an intensely deep and profound responsibility. And when that happens, that's what that means. That's the leadership responsibility. So this idea of claiming ignorance, well, then you failed as a leader if you're ignorant of what's going on in your organization. And there's the counterpoint to that might be, well, we have to trust our subordinates, especially in a special forces organization. Trust is everything, and that's how we get the autonomy of action that epitomizes soft action. But that trust has to be earned and has to be, frankly, validated and verified on a routine basis. And it works both ways. So there's trusting, you have to be trustworthy, and you have to trust, and it works in both directions. And so with all that being said, I think the challenge is to to obviously hold the leadership to account. But in terms of what can be done, I think there's something to be said. Again, this goes back to the piece about cohesion, where we talked about how do we build a cohesive unit, and how do we build a unit that is going to remain accountable. And this goes to a concept of trust as particular that is not new, but I don't know if it's been something we've talked about a lot recently. This idea of swift trust, and the idea of trust through understanding of common training standards, common educational backgrounds, and things like that, common sense of values, frankly, that we can all agree to, that then allows for that trusting and trustworthy relationship to really take hold. And so Rob Engen, a colleague of mine and co-editor of a book that we have coming out actually any day now called Why We Fight, where a lot of our research around this topic I think will be of interest. Al English and Rob Engen and I co-edited this volume, and Rob Engen wrote a book a couple of years ago where he talks about swift trust and about the piece of cohesion, questioning, basically how did units on the Allied side during the Second World War, he's coming at this from a historian, how did they maintain their combat effectiveness when they were constantly being subjected to replacements, this almost unending supply of replacements? And you would think that new faces all the time in a unit would really erode cohesion, and it didn't. Those units continued to fight incredibly effectively all the way through to the liberation of Berlin. And so how did that happen? And he attributed it to everyone understanding that these soldiers that are coming in, yes, they're replacements, yes, they haven't seen combat yet, but they've all gone through the same training we did, and we know that training is good. And so we can trust them implicitly. And so that idea is talking about what can be done. Those are some of the ways we can think about this, is think of it in terms of really buckling down and focusing in on training that needs to be done. And so to link this back to the Somalia inquiry, one of the major deductions that came out of the Somalia inquiry for the Canadian Armed Forces was the need for education of our officer corps, in particular looking at ethics and how do we inculcate those right values? Because as we've all said already, the military is a reflection of society for good and ill. And I think the Canadian Armed Forces even today is still struggling with that. We've got Operation Honor, which is working on the response to the Deschamps report and the sexualized culture that we have in the military that we're fighting against, as well as a recent initiative by our Chief of Defense Staff against hateful conduct, which is a more broad and more expansive look at some of the ways in which we're treating other people, both within the ranks and outside. And I think it has all sort of revolves around the same challenges we're talking about here. But again, that's why I checked the calendar when I read the Brereton Report, is because I'm like, did we not learn anything in terms of what needs to be done? And this idea of education being implicit in what it means to be an officer, I think is really, really important. Because really one of the roles as officers is to be the gatekeepers of what is right. We're crafting and transmitting orders. So ideally, we don't want our soldiers to question them, because they're going to be good orders. They're going to be well thought out. They're going to be just. They're going to be lawful. That's the whole reason why we exist as officers.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I wonder, again, as you say, check the date on the report, right? Conduct after capture, Geneva Conventions training, it forms at many times in a person's career, the expectation of how you should deal with these kinds of categories of non-combatants. I would think there's no excuse that what happened allegedly in the report was somehow a matter of confusion, right? These are egregious examples that we've well exceeded the brief, and education of don't do this because it's a close call, or that's not how we treat prisoners. I think we're probably a little bit beyond that. But I want to get to Pauline again on this question of what can be done, and I want to really push your button here, because one of the reasons why maybe we don't learn these lessons across cultures, across incidents, is it's a few bad apples, right? That don't make a big deal of it. It's a couple of individuals who've exceeded the brief. Let's punish them individually, and then move on, because and it gets said by every politician, the vast majority of fill in the blank soldiers serve honorably. Well, is that a barrier to actually doing something necessary at a higher, more systemic, more institutional level, that it's just a couple of people who are, criminally insane or bad or evil, and we can't really do anything to ever get that number down to zero? So we just accept it.
I guess the way I think about it, and yeah, I'm not a fan of the few bad apples argument. The way I think about it is that we need to think about what's going on in the barrel that's producing the apples, and that it's sort of extraordinary. It's not an accident that these things happen, But it's also not an accident that the majority of people sort of manage to resist those impulses or resist committing war crimes. And so I think we need to look at what's happening in the culture, whether it's down at that patrol level and reading the Brereton Report. All I could think of is Vietnam, right? Because it was the same dynamic that you had in Vietnam, this sort of separation between people who are patrolling and then the officers. But so I think there's this question of culture, clearly, and certainly in terms of special forces, the issue of culture. But culture doesn't just like arrive fully manifest, right? It emerges and it comes from somewhere, and it evolves over time in very small segments that are then reinforced. And so a lot of times when people do sort of bad things, there's this initial sort of shock. But if you go and often look in their biography or look in their history, like there was plenty of evidence that this was coming down the pike, because human beings are habitual creatures. So if we're habitually bad, it's because it's been reinforced or we've been able to get away with it. And those people who, comport themselves honorably, it's because that honorable behavior then has been reinforced, or they've felt supported in that. So I think it's sort of two-pronged to figure out what's in the culture. And we've talked about a lot of the issues that may be producing this behavior. But I'd also like to look at what's in the culture that's reinforcing everybody else who's not doing this. And then how can we sort of leverage sort of what, Dr. Breed is talking about, leverage those pieces to expand and to reinforce those kinds of things so that people feel supported in being morally courageous. And that was something I was struck with the Fort Hood report in the last couple of days. It's really clear that was not supported in the culture, right? That it was not reinforced. And in fact, sexist behavior and all kinds of tolerance for really nasty stuff was in fact the order of the day. And people understood that was the case. So I think it's not just about what we say. We say, yeah, you got to follow the Geneva Conventions. But if we say that and then it's wink, wink, nod, nod, but you need to get the mission done, then we know what happens, right? So it's, yeah, you got to follow the standards at Enron, but then, yeah, we have our shareholders that we need to be responsible to, and profit is king or queen. So I would like us to think about culture and what are we reinforcing, and really interrogate, like, where did that culture come from? So this, what you see in this report, just like in Vietnam, did not just spontaneously emerge, from the bowels of Australia somehow, right? So there's a history to it and ways in which certain behaviors are reinforced that is worth looking at, because you can't change what you won't acknowledge. So I think you have to start there.
That's an excellent point. Jessica, I want to turn it over to you and let you come in on that broader question, what can be done. But I want to ask a particular issue that hopefully you can address in that as well. There's a question in the Q&A that talks about what's the impact of pardoning individuals like Gallagher, for example, and others here. What impact does that have in terms of reinforcing perhaps this culture where it's not allowed, but if you do it, you'll probably be okay because we can find a way around it. Is that overblown? Do you think that these pardons are so few and far between that they don't have that effect? Or do you believe that they really do have this corrosive impact on making it clear, one clear message about what's acceptable and what's not?
Well, I think the pardon, I actually answered that question in the chat because I found it really interesting. I mean, I think the pardon sends a terrible message. I mean, I wonder, and I'm not alone in that. A lot of military personnel also thought it was a terrible thing to do. I mean, it basically excuses military personnel across the board for anything they might do on the grounds that they are American soldiers. Essentially, that seemed to be the basis for the pardon, was that this person was an American soldier and ergo honorable, should be freed. And so that also is a perfect example of this prioritization of the perpetrator's interests above the victims, right? That we've got to look after the welfare of the perpetrator. We should be sympathetic to them. Maybe they were stressed or they were under fatigue or, whatever, but our sympathy should be with them and not with the victim. So that's a really perfect manifestation of that, which then just, I think, reinforces the idea that, again, our sympathy should be with them. But I think more troublingly is not just you have pardons, but you also just have a lack of accountability in other cases. And so, for example, in relation to the US torture program, aside from a couple of people at Abu Ghraib, no one's been held accountable. And Obama basically said at one point that, that everybody people involved thought they were doing the right thing. And that seemed to be a reason not to hold them accountable, which is extraordinary because, of course, many people involved, for example, in the Nazi genocide, believed they were doing the right thing. And we don't take that as a reason not to hold them accountable. So again, whose perspective do we prioritize when we think about accountability? And ultimately, it has to be the perspective of the victims, right? It doesn't matter if the perpetrators believe they were doing the right thing. That's not the framework that we should adopt when thinking about the necessity of accountability. So in terms of, I'm sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, because that's an interesting point. When I was in Cambodia at the Khmer Rouge trials, one of the innovative features of that hybrid court system was the introduction, the formal role for victims to confront people like Doik, for example, who ran the S-21 torture and extermination camp. Do you think that there's ever any possibility, given that we already don't listen to complaints from the locals, that we could ever incorporate some form of victim role into the proceedings even in military courts, where perhaps that would lend that credence that even if it's post facto, there will be a reckoning or an opportunity to explain, you took away a father, you took away a son, you took away a daughter, and actually have that perhaps resonate more? Or is that really pie in the sky thinking?
Well, the optimistic side of me would, I think it would be amazing if we could do that. And I think that is actually essential to a true reckoning with participation in war crimes. Will it actually happen? I don't think so, to put it bluntly. At least, I don't know. I mean, I think there's maybe more possibility of something like that happen maybe after the Brereton Report, although I'm a little bit pessimistic about that, given the way the debate has moved toward worrying about the welfare of the soldiers as being the primary concern, which again, it is an important concern, but we've got to think about here what we owe the victims. And so I think, the sort of three arms of sort of suggested ways of moving forward that Matt and I discussed in the book included accountability was one, also about really making sure through education that military personnel understand that they can be that good people can commit war crimes. Like that has to be, the starting point, like, getting, and Dr. Wetham talks, I think, in the report about actually they've done this at, I think, one military academy in Australia, the name just escapes me, but they had someone come in who had committed a war crime and talk about, what they did. And so, having that, because it's very easy to think, well, those people in the Special Forces unit in Afghanistan who committed those crimes, they're not like us, but they are like us. They're like other Special Forces soldiers in many ways. And I'm sure those soldiers at the start of their careers would have been horrified if you had said to them, oh, one day you'll be murdering civilians. They would have been, I'm sure they would have been absolutely outraged. So that kind of recognition that, this path towards committing war crimes is not reserved just for the bad people, right? That, any of us can be on that path, and we might be set on that path through, it could be institutional, in a sense, approval or policies which lead to the commission of war crimes, or it could be something more ground up, I guess, which is, I think, the case in the Special Forces, coming from that small unit culture that Pauline referred to. So there has to be that willingness to acknowledge that capacity, I think, before there can be true progress. Otherwise, we're just repeating this pattern of like, oh my Lord, shock and horror, this terrible thing occurred. How could it ever happen? Well, so that's one thought.
Let me push that out a little bit further, because again, if we really want to talk about, it's just repeating itself over and over again. Well, partly because the units we're talking about, Canadian Airborne Regiment, Special Operating Forces, other places, tend to be white and male. So is there a route out of this potentially through a more diverse makeup of those kinds of units, where to counter some of that toxic masculinity, there would be a more fulsome range of the gender spectrum, to get away from this white supremacy and a negative othering of brown and black bodies? We might see a bigger push to have a more diverse makeup of these units. Pauline, again, similarly, is that a reasonable expectation, or is it really, beyond the pale of the immediate? And maybe I'll ask the same question to Christian.
So very quickly, I mean, I think there are lots of important ways of in diversifying units, whether that would lead to a reduction in war crimes. I think without substantial changes to the culture, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, because again, what it will mean to be part of that culture will be determined by these pre-existing models which have the problems that we've talked about.
Yeah, I would just, echo what Jessica just said, because I think, it may help to some degree. But we also had, in Vietnam, we had, heavy minoritized representation, and that didn't necessarily mitigate against crimes, against the, Vietnamese civilians. So I think, that may help to some degree, but I think then what happens is, so if you had, let's say, more people in this gender spectrum who become part of special forces, then when they become part of that unit, do they have to perform? And there's some evidence and studies on this, that they have to perform certain kinds of masculinity to fit in with the group, right? And the same thing with perhaps other kinds of diversity. So if the culture within these units doesn't change, all it does is maybe make your demographic diversity numbers look prettier from the outside, but does it actually have the potential to change the culture? Now, as those individuals perhaps advance, and assuming that they're not sort of corrupted or co-opted by that culture, can they slowly over time start to influence that culture? There may be some evidence that that is possible, but that's sort of a more of a long-term solution. And
Yeah.
like Jessica was saying, I'm kind of skeptical of that one, just looking at the United States, and in particular Vietnam, because I don't know that there was a lot of demographic diversity, especially in the enlisted ranks during Vietnam, that didn't necessarily seem to help. Now, you could argue there were other things at play there,
Sure.
but
I just wonder if waiting for the one perfect top-down solution is perhaps what's been eluding us, and we need to look at a combination of short, medium, and long-term,
right.
bottom-up, middle-out, and top-down solutions. Otherwise, we're just going to kind of repeat this, where you might fix it for a while until it's confronted in the field again, and then because you really haven't fundamentally changed much other than wagging fingers, and a few individuals are prosecuted, some officers retire, and then you hope that, against all hope, that you'll get a different result the next time. Christian, maybe you could come in on that. Do you think that certainly in the Canadian Armed Forces, this idea of strength through diversity is a large component of the current leadership, coming from Op Honor, but also from the CDS and from the Chief of Army? Do you see this as a way out of, or a partial solution to this?
Yeah, it's definitely part of the solution. Of course, the challenge is, we go right back to first principles again, right? What's the definition of culture? Well, it's values and identities that are replicated over time, over generations, right? So instantly changing the culture of anything is going to take time, and it takes persistent efforts towards the same goal for a long time, which is challenging in an organization like a military, where we're trying to get away from what's worked and what's been done. And I shouldn't say it's what's worked, but what's been done in the last few centuries. So to make those kind of big course corrections, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of attention. So there's that challenge. But I think the challenge, the issues of waiting for the right people to come to the top, I think we've already discussed it. They're going to be having to conform. Norman Dixon's classic work on this about like promoting like really shines a light on the limitations of that idea. So yes, we can get it from the internally to change, and I think there's hope for mid-grade officers perhaps that are of our generation to sort of try to change things from within. But again, they're going to be coming up against really some pernicious cultural barriers that are there that are going to be hard to overcome. There's definitely efforts that can be done from outside the military, from government, that can help, and we're seeing that in Canada for sure. Again, education and training at the lowest levels, at the elementary level. So as we take in new recruits, new officer candidates, how do we shape this at the right level? And there's questions that are mirrored in society as well that we need to get our heads wrapped around. Not to minimize the problems that we're finding in the military, but these problems are in society as well. And how do we fix that? I teach at Queen's University as well, and a lot of the challenges with toxic masculinity and all these cultural issues that we're talking about in the military are in a civilian university as well, and equally problematic. And it starts right in high school. You know, I've got kids going into high school, nieces and nephews in high school. You know, Pauline, you mentioned you have teenage children. This is reality, whether we're, you know, even outside the military. And so this is something we really have to get a grip on as a society. But one of the things that I think is interesting is the work of Vanessa Brown and Al Okros coming out of the Canadian Forces College, where they looked at the idea of loose culture to get around this idea that in order to advance, you have to conform. And I think that is something, if this gets bought in by the right people at the right levels, this idea that there are multiple identities that a soldier can take, then we're on the path to something that might work. And so, you know, the deduction there, so what? Well, how do we get those multiple identities to be recognized and valued and seen as equal and as right and proper in terms of the military? That's the next challenge, of course. But I think that might be a clue that we could potentially go down and explore further. Is what are the various identities that constitute what it means to be in the military?
Yeah, I think that's a hopeful note. Again, nothing that's going to happen overnight, and certainly not necessarily transformable at the you know, by any one particular individual. Constant effort to be aware of these kinds of issues rather than surprised or feigning faux surprise when they happen all the time, and this idea that, you know, that there's a constant vigilance that has to be in place in order to be aware of these things. We could talk forever, and I'm sure we would love to do so. We've already come to the end of our hour. I thank you very, very much. I'd like everyone in the audience, those who asked questions, those who didn't, to give themselves a big round of applause for joining us on this important topic. If you could all join me in giving our panelists a thunderous applause, which would peel off the ceiling and the walls if we were all in one common auditorium, and to say thank you for being very frank and open with your research expertise and your personal expertise in these areas. Hopefully, you know, we can say that by airing these kinds of issues and expanding the dialogue and the discussion outside of the very narrow specialist field, that perhaps more people can become engaged and ask these kinds of questions of their politicians, of military officers that they may come in contact with. So thank you very much.